So over the last year or two, all of the RiverLife leaders between both campuses have sensed the need to shift and transition the way we think and as we function as a church. Being 10 years older with two campuses, we saw dynamics that we had to address. And we realized that what got us here can't get us there. That's been a tagline that every week I'll hear someone say at the office. What got us here won't get us there. And so a really quick example is when we first launched the youth ministry, I only had to take like a 12-passenger van to take all of our youth to Lou. Tommy and Tim are estimating that we're going to have upwards of 70 to 80 students to go to Lou. And so what got me to Lou back in 2016 with the first youth group at RiverLife won't get our students now in 2025 to Lou, all 80 of them. And so we have to think of different ways of how we do things. And so again, what got us here won't get us there. What we did 10 years ago was great, but we knew it couldn't sustain us for the years to come. And so one of the major things that we had to reconsider was our mission statement. So last year we made a big shift and changed RiverLife's mission statement from hope, healing, and growth to next gen Hmong and beyond to we are a next generation Hmong church experiencing God together. We saw that our old mission statement was relevant to RiverLife 10 years ago, but it wasn't going to be relevant to the emerging generation or the future generations. Now, with the change to our mission statement, it meant that we had to find new values because values help us make decisions to support what it looks like to experience God together. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to talk about our 6 core values that will help shape and drive us to experience God together. These 6 values are going to help point us and direct us and support us and help us make decisions of how we get to experience God together. And so here are our 6 core values. The first one, we apprentice under Jesus. Number 2, we are ministers of restoration. 3, we work from an abundance mindset. 4, we entrust the next generation. 5, we are courageously transparent. And 6, we have fun together. You'll find this in your bulletin as well, too. And so again, these are the 6 core values that will help us make decisions so that we can fulfill our mission of experiencing God together. This morning, we begin with apprenticing under Jesus. Now, when it comes to being a Christian, it's not simply believing in Jesus and saying that you're a Christian, but it's becoming an apprentice under Jesus. It involves being with Jesus. It involves being like him and doing what he did. Now, this idea of apprenticing Jesus, the being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, doing what he did, this is commonly referred to as discipleship. If you've been in the church long enough, this is what discipleship is called. But we're choosing to use apprentice under Jesus because it's easier to understand. And if you say apprenticeship, if you say apprentice, we all have an idea of what an apprentice is. We all have an idea of what it involves. Apprenticeship at the core is a person learning a particular skill or trade by going under the guidance of an experienced mentor over a duration of time. And apprentices begin by taking on simpler tasks, and over time they take on more and more responsibilities. And as their skills improve, and when they complete their apprenticeship, they are certified, and they often receive jobs to do what they were trained for, and they oftentimes become the mentor of new apprentices. The goal of an apprentice is to do what they are trained for. And when it comes to apprenticeship, this isn't a unique or a new model. It's been with us for a long time. Jesus used this model with his 12 disciples. The early church adopted it to train and develop leaders in the church. But even then, apprenticeship wasn't unique it didn't even start with Jesus. Jesus adopted it from the Jewish culture where rabbis, the spiritual leaders equivalent to pastors, would take on apprentices. And so John Mark Comer, a pastor and an author, describes apprenticeship in his book, Practicing the Way, like this. In the Jewish culture, becoming a rabbi or a great scholar of the scriptures represented life's greatest achievement. And so, again, in Judaism, if you became the rabbi, if you became the spiritual spiritual leader, that was considered life's greatest achievement. It was so important that the process started when boys were as young as 5 years old. Boys would study and memorize the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Jewish faith refers to that as the Torah, and this continued till they turned 12 or 13. The best and the brightest who memorized and who understood the Torah would continue to study and memorize the entire Old Testament, while the remaining, and there was a majority of them, they would return to their family business. They would learn what their dad was doing and continue that versus their education in the Old Testament. From 12 to 17, only the best of the best would have an opportunity to apprentice under a rabbi, while the rest went to live ordinary lives. And so there was a very small group of elite students who, again, were at the top of their classes, who knew, again, their Old Testament. And again, those were the ones who were only qualified to apprentice under a rabbi. Even then, few who made it would apply to apprentice under a rabbi, but it was really hard to get into. The young men who wanted to become rabbis, who wanted to apprentice under a rabbi, would find a rabbi who they wanted to be like, and they begged the rabbi to be his apprentice. The rabbi in turn would test their knowledge of the Old Testament, would test and ask them their spiritual practices, their commitment to live this life. And if the rabbi found them worthy, they would invite them to follow the apprentice. They would invite the apprentice to follow them. The apprentice left their family, left their careers, and followed their rabbi, and reorganized their entire life around 3 things. The apprentice was to be with their rabbi, to become like their rabbi, and to do what their rabbi did. Apprentices were with their rabbi 24/7. They spent every moment waking and sleeping, observing their rabbi so they could become like him. Observation led to imitation so that the apprentice would one day become a rabbi himself. Now, when the rabbi thought that their apprentice was ready, he would bless them to go make disciples. And so when Jesus began his ministry, he invited 12 disciples to do the same thing, to be with him, to become like him, and to do what he did. Being a follower of Jesus wasn't simply believing in him and saying that they were Christians or believers, but it was also becoming an apprentice under Jesus. And Jesus makes this distinction very clear in Luke chapter 14, which Tila John read earlier during scripture reading. Generally, during Jesus' time, when he did have a group of 12 following him, his 12 disciples following him, there was also another group that followed him too. There were the disciples and there were the crowds. Although the crowds appear to be insignificant, they provide a very unique contrast to who the disciples are. And so up to this point, I was like, oh yeah, there's crowds following Jesus. But again, it acts kind of like if you know anything about like literature, they're the foil character. In comparison and in contrasting the disciples to the crowds, we notice a stark difference. As Jesus ministered, his disciples and the crowds would be present, but over time we start to see the difference between the two, and Jesus distinguishes that there is a difference between the two. Sure, they both follow Jesus, but Jesus reveals to us what it really means to follow him in Luke chapter 14, verse 25 to 35. And so I'm going to reread it again. It's going to be on screen, and so feel free to follow along as I reread it and see if you can notice some of these distinguishers. And so this is what it says. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. In this passage, Jesus distinguishes four major attributes that describe a disciple. First is disciples prioritize Jesus over everything. Second, disciples imitated Jesus. Third, disciples considered the cost of apprenticeship. And fourth, disciples made an impact. Let's start with the first. Disciples prioritize Jesus over everything. In verse 26, this is what Jesus says to explain this idea. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Being Jesus' disciple meant hating your family and your own life. Now, hate's a very strong word, and it feels contradictory to Jesus, but let me help explain so it makes sense. In the original biblical language, hate communicates this idea of having to choose one over the other to make that priority while rejecting that other so that it's secondary. It's not a one or the other, like I love Jesus and I hate my family, but it's choosing one to make it priority and then the other is secondary. And so if you had to choose between Jesus or a family, Jesus would be primary. Jesus makes it clear that disciples need to make him priority over their family and their life. And the thing is, Jesus invites disciples and us to choose him over family because our relationship with him, our apprenticeship under Jesus, once we get that right, our love for family is right as well too. So it's not that it's either or, it's not or, but it's a matter of, again, hate your family in the sense that Jesus is priority and that family is secondary. Second, disciples imitated Jesus. In verse 27, Jesus says, "And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciples." Now, this phrase, carrying your cross, referred to crucifixion, a form of capital punishment where convicted criminals were nailed to a cross. And the concept, when you heard someone say carrying your cross, it communicated this idea that the convicted criminal who was sentenced to be crucified, that they accepted their fate. They no longer were fighting. They were no longer looking for another trial, but they accepted their fate. So when Jesus describes a disciple as someone who carries their cross, it describes a person who has accepted Jesus' way of life instead of accepting their way of life. It further illustrated what it meant to prioritize Jesus. A disciple who carried their cross chose not to live a life they wanted, but they lived a life according to Jesus and imitated what Jesus did. And so we know Jesus carried his cross by accepting God's way of life, and so the disciples carried their cross by accepting Jesus' way of life. Third, disciples considered the cost of apprenticeship. Disciples considered the cost of apprenticeship. Apprenticing under Jesus is costly, and Jesus compared it to two things in verses 28 to 33. A person who wanted to build a tower and a king who was considering war. Both considered a cost to see if they can complete their goal because failure was shameful. Apprenticing under Jesus wasn't a casual decision. It wasn't like, I'll give it a shot. We'll see if it works out. Apprenticeship was costly. People left everything to apprentice under a master because they knew that the outcome of apprenticing under a rabbi or master was infinitely better, that it was worth it. And so when a disciple completed the apprenticeship process, again, it represented life's greatest achievement. That's why Jesus' disciples were so willing to leave everything at once to follow him. Lastly, the disciples made an impact. Apprenticeship meant that you made an impact. In verse 34, Jesus says this, "Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out." Now, all throughout the New Testament, the Gospel, salt was a common image that Jesus would use that illustrated this idea of preservation. During a time where there was no refrigerators, no freezers, no cold weather, salt was essential to cure meat so it would stop it from spoiling. And so Jesus often used the image of salt preserving meat as a way to describe the work that his disciples needed to do. They were supposed to share Jesus with others to help preserve them from being spoiled by sin. The disciples were expected to impact everyone around them in practical and meaningful ways. Now, that's the idea and the attributes of disciples. Now we turn to the crowds. In contrast to the crowds, they were the complete opposite. Where the disciples prioritized Jesus, the crowds did not prioritize Jesus. Instead, Jesus was more of a supplement or an add-on. Instead of imitating Jesus, the crowds went about life according to their own ways. Instead of considering the cost to follow Jesus, they saw it as an inconvenience to their lives. Instead of, again, it being costly to follow Jesus, they would follow Jesus whenever it was casual, whenever it was convenient. Instead of impacting other people's lives in a positive way, the crowd sought to improve just their lives. And so they seek Jesus for miracles, for free meals whenever Jesus fed the multitudes. Jesus didn't call us to be in the crowd. Jesus didn't call us to be the crowd. He called us to be his disciples. And so if we believe in him, if we're baptized in his name, we are his disciples and we are invited to apprentice under him. So why is it important for us to include this value, apprentice under Jesus, considering our new mission, experiencing God together? Why is apprenticing under Jesus important to experiencing God together? Why is it one of the values that will help us achieve what it means to experience God together? I think that if we want to experience God together, we have to learn how to live according to God's ways. If we believe that experiencing God together is the most important thing that we can do, we have to understand how God desires for us to live. And in order for us to do this, we have to apprentice under Jesus. We have to be with Jesus. We have to become like him, and we have to do what he did. And we know from Luke 14 that's going to require us to prioritize Jesus over everything. It's going to require us to imitate him. It's going to be costly, and it's going to require us to make an impact. And it's a lot, but it's going to be worth it. Over the week and weekend, as I was sermon prepping, as usual, I get distracted and spend a good chunk of my time scrolling through shorts on Facebook. And I realized that many of the videos that I was watching that popped up were negative interactions between people. They included things like road rage incidents, angry Karen interactions, Charlie Kirk college campus debates, tyrant police officers, First Amendment auditors. It's those folks who are, filming in public spaces trying to provoke a reaction. And at a certain point, realizing that I was supposed to be sermon prepping, I thought to myself, of all the things that are viral, all the things that show up in my feed, I am looped in so much negativity. Surely this isn't what God intended. And so I went back to sermon prepping and was reminded that experiencing God together is truly important. If we believe that God is a God of love, peace, kindness, joy, goodness, gentleness, patience, that is absolutely nothing that I see on any of my video feeds. I see the complete opposite. And there was a yearning of man, I wish our community was more loving, more peaceful, more kind, more joy, more good, more gentle, more, again, patient with each other. None of this bickering back and forth. And so it reminded me that our world doesn't give us that, but Jesus does. And because Jesus does, it begins with apprenticing under him. Apprenticing under Jesus is the process where we are transformed to be more like him. It begins with being with Jesus. And then while we're with Jesus, we are becoming like him. We're imitating him. And then we do what he did. So this morning, I want you to take some time, and I'm in this exercise as well too, and I want to encourage you to assess where your heart is. This morning, are you in the crowd that is casually following Jesus at your convenience? Or are you an apprentice dedicated at understanding who he is at whatever cost? There isn't a middle ground. It's either the crowds or an apprentice. Again, you're one or the other. I'm one or the other. If you find that you're in a crowd where Jesus has been convenient, following Jesus has been casual, it hasn't cost you anything, you're not prioritizing Jesus over everything else, I'd like to encourage you to consider a step that you can take to be his disciple. Can you consider what it means to prioritize him over other things? How can you reorient everything so that Jesus comes first? It might be easy to start with something that is really important to you and consider, how can Jesus come first before that one thing that is so important to me? If you're a disciple, if following Jesus has come to a cost, it's not that you're casually following Jesus, but there is a serious that I am chasing hard after Jesus. Stay determined. Stay gritty. Find ways to continue to be with him, to be more like him, to do what he does. So what does it mean of being with him? In Psalm 46:10, it reminds us to be still and know that I am God. This morning, Ben led us in a minute with Jesus. Those are just practical ways where we can simply be with him, to give him some attention, to see what he is saying to us. Consider how much time you're spending with Jesus in prayer, in scripture, in community. Being with Jesus is going to cost you time, but it's worth it. What are you willing to sacrifice to be with him? In verse 33 of the Luke chapter 14 that we read, Jesus reminds us this. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Apprenticing under Jesus means we are giving up what we want so that we can be with him. And so being a disciple of Jesus, being an apprentice under Jesus, so that we can understand what it means to experience God together and live according to his ways, it's going to cost you something. He isn't asking that you give up everything all at once, but are you willing to start abandoning something each day so that it can help you be with him? Second, how can you become like him this week? Identify one area where you are not like Jesus and find ways to imitate him. Maybe it's loving the unlovable. Maybe it's being compassionate to those who are in need. Maybe it's forgiving someone who wronged you. And lastly, how can you do what he did? Jesus calls you and I to be salt. This week, can you find a way to impact someone from spoiling and sin? Again, this idea of being salt is preserving people from being spoiled by sin. Can you find an unholy moment and make it holy? Whether it's talking behind someone's back, it's again, moments where it's not godly. Can you go in and find a way to turn that around and make it godly? Apprenticing under Jesus is no light work. It's going to be challenging, but it's necessary because the outcome of it is so worth it. And so our desire for RiverLife here and beyond is that we want us to experience God together. Again, to experience his love, his peace, his joy, his gentleness, his kindness. And we want the rest of our community and our world to experience that as well too. And for that to happen, it begins with practicing under Jesus. And so let's apprentice under Jesus together. Consider the cost, because it's going to be worth it, so that the rest of our world can experience Jesus with us. Let me pray for us.